May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Now, when I tell you that for a great deal of my life, my dad has gotten up at 4 a.m. to go to work 14-hour days, don't misunderstand. It wasn't because he would have been fired if he hadn't, or because he was in a job that wouldn't pay the bills unless he put in that many hours, or because he was in need of one of those labor unions he likes to scoff at. Deep down, my dad works those hours because he loves it. My dad is an accountant, and tax season, with its days of computation and takeout meals and nights of 4 hours of sleep, is like his playoffs. He's trained all year for this. Who will ascend to the top in the great accountancy bracket? Whose coffee pot will short out on April 1st? Whose carpal tunnel flare-up will leave him benched for the rest of the season? How many returns can he complete over everyone else's lunch hour? And God forbid, who is going to get stuck with the time-sucking clergy person whose taxes take 10 times longer than everyone else's? I move way down in the will during tax season. So if my dad was ever driven into church on the second Sunday of Pentecost year B, like you all are, he would hear a story about Jesus choosing to do work on the Sabbath. And I would bet my tax refund that he would cheer Jesus on. But that's the point of the story, isn't it? We're all supposed to be cheering radical Jesus, breaking the law and working on the Sabbath. The bad news about that reaction is that at the time when we start patting ourselves on the back for being like Jesus, when it just seems too easy, it probably is. It's a pretty sure sign that we're reading the story wrong. So let's start from the beginning. Let's start with what the Sabbath is. Missy and I went to Jerusalem the summer before last. It wasn't a guided tour through a business, or it's just a pilgrimage on our own, guided by a couple of books and what little knowledge I had retained from a previous visit, and a map that would have been more helpful if we had noticed that it was written in Spanish before we purchased it. But we muddled through, and one day, in that first week that we were there, we heard explosions in the distance. And of course, my fear-trained brain feared the worst, until it clicked, finally, that today was Friday, and they were actually fireworks. The city welcomed the Sabbath, Shabbat, the coming queen. We sat on the hotel balcony and watched, listening to the singing that started up inside, eating the hotel's cold cream cheese sandwiches set out for those unwitting Christians who wouldn't have thought to go to the market during the day because nothing would be open now for 24 hours. Everything ground to a halt. Whole streets were blocked off, and we'd walk because there were no buses, there was no light rail. And cars had been replaced by hordes of little Orthodox children who ran and scootered and kickballed all around their new asphalt playground. Their parents and grandparents and friends looking in on groups of chairs and gossiping circles. Folks hurried off to synagogue in these really shiny robes and furry hats that put our fanciest chasubles right to shame. We visited the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall, and we looked on, listening from the outside. The singing and the crying. We watched everything as outsiders. And inwardly, when I dug past the layers of my own conditioning, the shameful layer of my capitalistic annoyance at personal inconvenience, the layer of wide-eyed awe at the exotic, down past my American layer of concern about the division of church and state, I felt something like hunger, a longing to participate Like what they were doing was something I had known once. Walter Brueggemann says, Sabbath is not about worship. It is about work stoppage. It is about withdrawal from the anxiety system of Pharaoh, the refusal to let one's life be defined by production and consumption and the endless pursuit of private well-being. And I would add that Sabbath is not the end goal of work either. The day of self-indulgence is the reward for the endurance of the monotony of your labor. It is not the weekend you've been working for. That just perpetuates a system in which even the Sabbath is a profitable function. Even fun is programmed in. Plug in vacation, increase ultimate productivity, or at least head off a nervous breakdown. But Sabbath is the end of striving. It is for healing. Jesus shows up in the synagogue today. We don't know if he's wearing shiny robes or furry hats. Mark doesn't say. But we're early on in the gospel. And in the space of a scant 45 verses that have preceded this, he's been introduced, begun his ministry, and by the end of this story has managed to make folks mad enough to want to destroy him. He's thrown a wrench into something sacred here. Breaking the Sabbath isn't a simple message for us about the irrelevancy of blue laws. Nobody is very oppressed over blue laws. It is about everything in this world that sacrifices human well-being for the good of the system. If Jesus showed up today, I wonder how these stories would change. I think they would. If you have faith, you could say to this mountain, get up and throw yourself into the sea, and it would be done. But in the modern age of mountaintop removal, the miracle might very well be telling the mountain to stay put, in the action of faith required to make it so. What is good work here? Who could look at the work of the scarred landscape and say, this was good? No. We say, this was necessary. Jesus asks us to consider what rules us in our gospel today. There are tremendous forces. We all know this. We see it. Powers and principalities, the discarded plastics that we use serving our systems of ease and quantity and profit that are hidden in vast garbage islands in the ocean far from our consciences. The Second Amendment that has transformed during my life from something to memorize during history class to a rallying cry. A system where love of profit trumps the love of life. What rules us? But on a personal level, it's often hard to see the waters that we swim in. Perfectionism that projects out onto unwritten expectations for others. The insecurity that breeds isolation. That anxiety that finds work stoppage impossible. What decisions do we make for speed, ease, quantity, and what ones create well-being with God and neighbor? What would Sabbath look like if we turned back to the heart of the story today, like this? If Jesus walked in now, how would it change? Maybe he'd stop our work. Maybe he'd institute a Sabbath and take our withered hands, withered from wringing them constantly over our own security, an uncertain future, the actions of others. Maybe those would be the hands he would heal, to stop for a stretch of time. Our swords or computers or calculators beaten into shovels that work the ground. To look and admire and to walk in a way that takes nothing, that asks for nothing, but echoes the Spirit of God that looks at such a fragile earth and a transitory life and says, "This is good."